workshop about worry and COVID-19. My name is Lara Koo and I'm a Senior Psychological Wellbeing Practitioner in iCope. I'm also here with my colleague.
Hi, my name's Caroline. I'm also a Senior Psychological Wellbeing Practitioner in Camden.
Before we start, here's a brief introduction to iCope. iCope are a psychological therapy service offering treatment primarily for depression and anxiety disorders. We offer a range of different treatments recommended by NICE guidelines and focus primarily on cognitive behavioural therapy. The aim of this workshop is to understand worry, where it comes from, and to learn some techniques for managing it. This is a recorded workshop, so you can watch it in your own time. There may be moments when you want to pause to try out some of the techniques. You may want to allow around up to 1 hour to give you some time to do some of the exercises. Some parts may feel relevant to you, so do make sure you write anything down that you think will be especially helpful, or maybe even take a photo or a screenshot of the slide. Just to touch briefly on some safety information, we know that it can be really common at times of heightened distress to experience thoughts of being better off dead or wanting to harm ourselves in some other way. In particular, if you're feeling low or struggling with lots of anxiety. So if you do feel like you need more urgent support and you're feeling suicidal, then we'd recommend contacting your GP and asking to see them for an emergency appointment. Or there's also the Camden and Islington crisis line and Samaritan's helpline as well.
So in terms of what we'll be covering today, we'll start off with defining worry and how we think about worry within the context of cognitive behavioural therapy. We'll also be looking at how this links to the body's natural response to threat and anxiety. We'll then be talking about different types of worry, and we'll get into more specifics in terms of the coping techniques that you'll use to manage worry and to help things feel a bit more manageable. We'll also review some of the techniques and then bring in a few other concepts around compassion and the media. So let's start off by talking about what worry is. Worry is a type of self-talk, and what we mean by that is that it is something that very much happens within our head. It's the way we speak to ourselves when we're thinking through potential problems or threats. Worry is often future focused, so we'll think about things that we might encounter in the future. It's also incredibly normal. We all worry, it's a part of sort of human experience. And it's very normal and understandable to have increased worry during the current pandemic. But despite it being quite normal, it can become very problematic, especially when it becomes excessive or it takes up a lot of our time and energy. And often it can lead into a worry spiral, which can make it very difficult to control. So that means that it can start off with a very small worry, and it can then kind of spiral into a much bigger worry. And we'll look at this a little bit later on. Worry can then lead us to feel generally quite anxious and apprehensive, and it can often lead us to focus on sort of worst case scenarios that might be either quite unlikely or quite unhelpful to focus on.
There can be a number of different types of triggers for worry and anxiety. And here are some situations when worry actually becomes quite common. So, for example, an ambiguous situation where things are open to different interpretation, or when a situation is novel or new, so we don't have any experience to fall back on. If we look at the example of going skydiving, this is a particularly unique experience. Many of us won't have done this before. So if you were to imagine going skydiving for the first time, it's very likely that you might feel quite anxious and quite worried. And that might be similar to the situation that we're now in with COVID. Another trigger for worry is situations which are unpredictable, where it's unclear how things will turn out. And for many of us, this will sound quite familiar at the moment with this current worldwide health situation. And it makes sense that people are experiencing a lot of worry. It's a very unusual situation, and there's a lot of uncertainty which can naturally lead us to worry and feel quite anxious.
So as Lara said, there's a lot of uncertainty at the moment, and it's only natural that we would worry more. We say that worrying is a way that we try to manage or cope with uncertainty. So when things are uncertain, we'll sort of worry because we hope it'll make us feel better. So that uncertainty generates worry, but then that worry then fuels the uncertainty, and it becomes what we call a vicious cycle. It can be helpful to remember that uncertainty is an inevitable part of life. Regardless of what kind of situations are going on more worldwide, we can never be 100% certain of how things are going to, of what things are going to happen. And this idea of becoming more kind of comfortable and accepting of uncertainty can really significantly reduce our distress around anxiety. And it can also help us focus on the things that we can control, as opposed to some of the things that we can't control. And this is an idea that we're going to expand on more in the following slides.
So worry can be something which is helpful. And a good way to distinguish between what is helpful and unhelpful worry is to consider this statement. So worry is only helpful if it leads to action. There can be a continuum of what we might label normal worry, so something that helps us to prepare or to get what we want and to problem solve. However, this can sometimes become excessive and can leave us feeling quite upset and exhausted. And this is really where worry takes over and stops us from taking any action. The worry chain shows an example of some quite typical thoughts that some of us might be having at the moment around coronavirus. So it might start off with something quite small, like I have a headache, and that could trigger lots of other thoughts, which often start with what if. So this is where we start to picture situations which we have no mental control over, and that can lead to some quite distressing thoughts, as you can see in the chain. What we often try to do with worry management is distinguish between these different types of worry, and this can help us essentially to decide what to do later on and how to manage it. When we talk about helpful worries, we often call these practical worries. These might be things that need a solution right now. For example, not having enough food in the house. So here, there may be some kind of solutions that you can generate to deal with this. On the other side, we've got hypothetical worries. So these are worries about things that don't exist at the moment, but may happen in the future. Often these are kind of worst case scenarios. For example, what if I lose my job and end up homeless? Or thinking about getting quite unwell or even dying. So there's a real element of catastrophizing and really picturing the worst case scenario. We'll come back to talking about these later on, and it could be a good idea to start to distinguish between the different types of worry that you're actually having.
So this is the vicious cycle of worry, and it's one of the key concepts within cognitive behavioural therapy, is this idea of a vicious cycle. So the idea behind this is that in any given situation, we will have certain thoughts, we will have certain emotions, we'll have certain physical sensations, and we'll have certain behaviours. And all of these 4 areas are interlinked and they can impact each other. And that's why you see the arrows all kind of join in both directions. So this particular example, the thoughts, what if I catch it? What if I pass it on to a loved one? What if this never stops? These are hypothetical worries. And it's understandable that if you have these worries and you really sort of focus a lot of attention on them, that it's going to lead to certain emotions. So these thoughts might lead you to feel quite anxious, quite stressed or overwhelmed, feel like you're kind of emotionally a bit out of control, or also quite emotionally tired. Then we'll have certain physical sensations as well. So because of the way we are feeling and the thoughts in our head, we might find that we can't sleep as well. Might find that we're more restless. Maybe we become hot and sweaty, or our heart beats faster. I don't know if any of these are sounding familiar to any of you. We know that people can experience a whole different range of things within these different categories. And then in terms of the final box, the behaviour box, often the way that we think, the different feelings that we have and how we feel physically will impact the things that we might do. So for example, because of anxiety, we might stay in bed, we might check the news to see if things have changed. We might, or to maybe try and find some answers. We might check ourselves regularly for symptoms of coronavirus. We might procrastinate doing some of the things that we know that we should be doing, or we might stop speaking to our friends because it feels too overwhelming or too difficult. Another key behaviour that we might do is worry. And we put worry in the behaviour part because although it's something that happens in our head, it is something that we actively engage in. Even though at times it can feel very uncontrollable. And it's something that we tend to do instead of doing something else. And that's why we think of it as a behaviour. And we'll be looking more at the process of worry and thinking about worry as a behaviour and as a process that we can hopefully change. So hopefully you can see that the behaviours that we have highlighted, we might do these things in response to our thoughts, emotions and physical sensations, but they can also help to fuel those same thoughts, emotions and physical sensations as well. For example, checking for symptoms or avoiding speaking to friends can heighten our distress. It can heighten our kind of thoughts and focusing on the worst case scenario. And it can also sort of make us more likely to focus on our physical sensations as well. So often people come for help because of how they feel. And that might be why you're listening to this today, because you feel sort of anxious or stressed or overwhelmed. But we know it's very difficult to directly impact our emotions. And what we know is easier, but it's still difficult, is to impact our behaviours. And because those arrows are bidirectional, by changing our behaviours, it will then feed back into how we feel, how we think, and how we feel physically. And that's why today we're going to look at the behaviour changes to think about how we can sort of manage worry better. So now might be a time to pause the video and to have a think yourself about what is happening for you when you get worried. What are your own thoughts that you have? What emotions that lead to? What do you feel physically when you feel anxious? And what kind of behaviours do you notice that you might do or not do as a response to that? So now I want to talk a little bit more about anxiety and the body. So anxiety, as we mentioned earlier, is a very natural response that the body has. It's also a very old response. You might notice when you feel anxious that you develop some of the physical sensations that are mentioned here, such as feeling dizzy or your heart beating faster or having stomach problems or tense muscles. This is all part of the body's natural fight or flight alarm system. And this is caused by our body releasing adrenaline into our bloodstream, and the chemicals released will then make these changes to our bodies to allow us to fight or run away from danger. And historically, this is a system our body developed through evolution. So when we were cavemen, it was a very useful system to help fight off woolly mammoths or tigers or escape from danger, and when we literally need to fight or fight our way out of it. So our lives have obviously changed a lot, but this system has not changed. And we're still using this very outdated system as a way of responding to threats. But the world we live in today, we're not having the same threats. It's not, the system isn't being triggered by the threat of wild animals. It's being triggered off by things like uncertainty, or the fear of the unknown, or by our worries. And I suppose you may want to kind of pause the slide, the video now, and have a quick look at this slide and see if you recognise any of those symptoms. Maybe you can add that to your vicious cycle from the slide before. And underneath each of these different symptoms, it says a bit about why your body is reacting in this way, and that actually the body is trying to help us. It is meant to be a kind of helpful response. But it's just that our worlds are so different now from when this system was first created that it doesn't feel as helpful as it might have done. But it can be helpful to understand kind of why our body is doing this, and the fact that it is it is very kind of natural, and it's not harmful even if it feels very uncomfortable at the time. So let's move on to our first worry management technique. So this is what we call the worry tree, and it's a tool to help us categorize our worries. So Lara mentioned earlier that we often think about worry as being in two different types, practical worries and hypothetical worries. So this worry tree helps us sort of break down the process of worry a little bit more, in terms of thinking about firstly how we categorize our worries, but then also what we then do with those worries, because how we deal with hypothetical worries is different from how we deal with practical worries. So hypothetical worries, where we have no control over the situation. So is there something I can do about this? No, there isn't anything that I can do about it. That would make it a hypothetical worry. And then we want to go down the different steps in terms of the worry tree. So if it's something that you can't do anything about, we would move to this idea of letting the worry go, and we'll come back to that in a moment. But I suppose it emphasises there's nothing further that we need to do with that worry, because thinking about it further is not going to change anything. It's not going to make that worry disappear. It's just going to make us focus on things that we can't control. Then on the other side, we have things that we can do something about. So these are the practical worries. So these are things where we want to kind of, we can do something about it. So rather than sitting and thinking about the problem, what we find is more helpful is to think about what we can do. So making a plan of action, thinking about what we can do, when we can do it, how can we do it. And it might be that you're having these worries at a time where you can't physically enact your plan. Maybe you're just about to go to sleep, or maybe you're in the middle of doing something else that you have to finish. Then in that case, we'd encourage you to schedule in when you're going to take those actions. And then you can thank your worry, because your worry has then led you to take action. If you hadn't had that worry, you wouldn't have been able to come up with that plan. So it's now okay to let that worry go because it has served its purpose. However, if you're in a situation where you can act on that worry straight away, you can do the actions that are going to be helpful to solve that practical worry, then we would encourage you just to do them straight away and not put off that step. And then again, you can let the worry go because the worry has served its purpose. Now we know we say let the worry go, and these might seem like very small words. And it is a simple idea, but it's definitely not an easy idea. And it's something that we're going to talk about a lot more in the following slides. And we're going to look at some strategies to help you feel more able to do just that, more able to sort of let the worry go. But we'd really encourage you to use the worry tree as your sort of primary tool for helping you distinguish between the different kinds of worries. we're often very good at noticing that we feel tense or that we feel anxious, but we're sometimes less good at pinpointing exactly what it is that we're worried about. And this is where this is the first sort of step in terms of managing worry. So if we onto the next slide, there is a tool that we can use to help us with this called the worry diary. So the worry diary is basically just a way for us to write down our worries, to have a kind of record of them. So you might want to put, this is an example by the way, so you can kind of adapt it or kind of write it in your phone or do it however you want. But you might want to put a bit of context about the situation, so where you are. But the important bit is writing down what it is that you're thinking, what's your worry, and whether it's hypothetical or practical. And you can also put as well how anxious it makes you feel out of 0 to 10, because some worries might be more problematic than others, and it can be quite useful to be aware of what worries bother you most. So this is something that we would encourage you to do, and to write it down or to type it, with the idea being that the more we practice doing this, the better we get at just categorizing our worries automatically, and eventually that will internalize that process, and we'll be able to categorize our worries without needing to write it down. But in order to get to that process, we have to practice first. So you might want to pause and think about how you're going to start your worry diary. Is it something that you want to do on your phone? Do you have do you prefer to write things down? Maybe type things up on a computer. What would work best for you? So maybe pause the video and just think about that for a few moments. So once you've got the hang of differentiating between the different worries, between the hypothetical worries and the practical worries, then you can move on to trying this technique, which is about specifically managing the hypothetical worries. And that's often the worries that people find most problematic. So if you think about how much time you spend in your day worrying about hypothetical worries, I expect it's more than 20 or 30 minutes. So the goal of worry time is to condense that worrying time down into a concrete 20 to 30 minute period each day, and allowing yourself that time to focus on your worries. This might sound a bit of a strange idea, but it can be really effective. And what we find is that people will write down that hypothetical worries, and they'll say to themselves, I'm not going to worry now, I'm going to worry about this in my designated worry time. And just knowing that they set a time for themselves later on in the day to worry helps them put that worry aside for the moment and refocus their attention on the here and now. And they can postpone their worries to a time where they can control, so it's not sort of taking up all of the day. And this means in this way we're not sort of saying don't worry, but it's more just sort of saying I'm not going to worry now, I'm going to worry at a time that's a bit more convenient for me. So it's about getting a bit of control back over your worries, rather than letting it sort of dictate your entire day. So the process would be, as it says here, kind of setting your time, sort of pre-arranging with yourself when that time is going to be, and making sure it's not too close to bedtime. And then noticing your worry and putting it down in your worry diary. And then just reminding yourself that if it's a hypothetical worry, you will come to that later. And then just trying to pay attention to what you're doing at that time, and reassuring yourself that you'll come back to it at your designated worry time. And then when you have your worry time, we would also encourage you to end worry time by doing something that's quite engaging. So something that's going to kind of take your mind off your worries, or kind of give it a kind of a solid ending. So for example, some people like to do their worry time just before they cook dinner, or just before they have agreed to have a video call with a friend, or just before they do exercise, something like that. So there's a kind of a thing that you're going to do afterwards. People are often worried that worry time will never end. You know, they kind of say, how can I condense all my worries to 20-30 minutes when I'm spending all day worrying now? But we'd encourage you to give it a go. And actually, what we find more often than not is that people don't need those 20-30 minutes, and it doesn't tend to kind of be as bad as you think. And sometimes, worrying is categorized by worry, and often we do worry about worry itself and worry about the techniques, and that's all normal, and it's all a part of this process. So we would just encourage you to give it a go and see if you find that process of delaying or postponing your worries means that you can engage in the rest of your day better. So you may want to pause the video and think about how you're going to plan your worry time. So the next, so this slide is all about planning worry time. When will it start? When will you have it? The duration. What will I put on my list? Where will I put my list, sorry, when worry time is over? And what will I do to relax after worry time? So just take a few minutes to answer those questions and pause the video, and then we'll continue.
We're now going to move on to some other types of techniques which are more emotion focused mechanisms for helping get depth. One exercise that we can practice is something called present moment focus. So this is about switching our attention that we have in our lives and choosing to focus on something else. As Caroline mentioned, worry is very much us. So we're not trying to actively think about something, because that's very difficult. For example, if I said, don't think about the elephant for the next minute, you'll probably find that it's actually really difficult. The aim of this exercise is to shift our focus onto something else. So you might still be acknowledging and noticing that worry, but then reminding yourself that actually perhaps it isn't unhelpful or a hypothetical worry. One analogy that we can use to describe this learning process is that of training a puppy. At first we might find that our puppy is always running off and it's never going where we tell it to, but we might train a puppy by gently and deliberately calling it back to us. You might find that your attention, very much like the puppy, might then run off again, but we can just call it back, and in a similar way, this process becomes easier the more that you do it. So the more you practice it, the more you train yourself to be able to do it, and the easier it will become for your attention to stay focused on one thing and to wonder less. This exercise uses our 5 senses to help us focus on the present moment and to fill our attention with what's happening in the here and now. So we'll pay attention to what we can see, what we can feel, what we can hear, and our other senses like smell and taste. One way that we can do this is in a short grounding exercise called 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So in this exercise, you take a couple of minutes just to sit where you are and try to write down, or even say out loud, 5 things that you can see, 4 things that you can feel, 3 things that you can hear, 2 things that you can smell, and 1 thing that you can taste. So maybe take a couple of minutes now to pause the video and to try that exercise out. If you have been able to try this exercise out, it might be helpful to reflect on what you did notice about it. So did you notice that you were very focused on worries, or were you able to focus on some of these different things? If you found it more difficult and it was very hard to focus away from the worry, then that is normal, and this is something that takes a lot of practice. Another emotion-focused coping mechanism is something called progressive muscle relaxation. Earlier, Caroline talked a little bit about that link between the physical sensations and the body's adrenaline response system. We know that our bodies respond automatically to stressful situations and thoughts by becoming tense, but the opposite relationship also works, and therefore a good way of relaxing the mind is also to deliberately relax the body. In progressive muscle relaxation, what we do is we take each muscle group and we tense it and then release the tension. This relaxes our muscles and it allows us to notice the contrast between that tension and that relaxed state. So if you were to practice this a lot, you might find that you start to notice when your body is tense much more quickly and therefore not hold on to so much of that tension. So there is a link here to a SoundCloud exercise which is about 14 minutes long, and if you'd like to try that, please do pause the video and have a listen, or you may want to try it later on. It's important to highlight as well that relaxation should be an enjoyable exercise, so if any part of this is difficult or painful, then please do skip to the next part, and if you have any injuries you may wish to leave out any particular parts of that exercise as well. So we've talked a little bit about helpful and unhelpful worry, and it's also important to think about what's in our control. And so why it's completely natural for us to get lost in particular worries, like some of that you might see here, we know that it's not useful or it's not helpful. So the more that we focus on what's not in our control, the more hopeless or anxious we're likely to feel. One of the most useful things that anyone can do in a particular type of crisis, whether that's related to COVID or something else, is really to try and focus on what is in our control. We may not be able to control certain things that happen in the future, so that might be things like government responses or what's going on in the economy. And it's very difficult for us to control how we feel. But what we do have more control over are things that we do. So things that are in the here and now. And that can make a really big difference. So the more control that we have over some of these things, which you might notice are all very behavioural, the less likely we are to feel anxiety and feel like things are unmanageable. A particular focus in cognitive behavioural therapy is around our behaviours. And we know that this is something which is more controllable as opposed to thoughts or feelings or anything that pops into our mind. And so that's a really important goal here, which is to focus on behaviours and what we can do.
One of the things that we may not be able to control are the kinds of thoughts that come into our head. And that may be because thoughts are very automatic and worry is very automatic as well. But we can start to control how we react to those thoughts. And that's what we are doing by introducing some of the strategies today. But as well, we can also control how we might react to it in terms of ourselves. So sometimes people feel very frustrated, annoyed, or angry at themselves for worrying. But it's helpful to remember that it is really normal, and worry is not necessarily the sign of anything bad or any kind of failure, and it's a really normal way to deal with a global crisis. And we're all doing the best that we can in a really unprecedented situation. So it can be very helpful to kind of practice this sense of being compassionate to ourselves. And it might be that it's become a bit of a habit to respond to feeling worried or stressed or finding things are difficult by being quite hard on ourselves. And often this is quite unhelpful. It can lead us to sort of continue on with that vicious cycle. So maybe the next time you're feeling a bit stressed or worried, you might want to notice what you're saying to yourself. And if you are kind of saying things to yourself like I shouldn't feel this way, or why can't I manage, what's wrong with me, you might want to sort of think, is there any other way of looking at this? Is there something that I could say to myself that I might say to a friend if a friend was to say this to me? Often we can be better at being compassionate towards other people than we are to ourselves. And that's why sometimes it can be helpful to think about things in a slightly different way. And some of the negative and unhelpful things that we're saying to ourselves are often quite exaggerated and biased. So it may be that you can take a few minutes just to think if there's anyone in your life, you know, that would talk to you in a compassionate way, and maybe try and channel what they would say to you. Or you can always even think of a well-known role model like Nelson Mandela and think what someone like that would say to you. And again, this is something that takes a bit of practice, because our natural response and our natural habit is to be quite critical. So it might be that this takes a little bit of time for us to slowly start to shift the way that we start to talk to ourselves.
I'm saying we've looked at a range of different techniques, and a lot of these things really do need practice. So at the beginning they might be quite hard to do. We might find that actually it takes quite a lot of energy to really try and hone in on some of these things, but the more we practice them, the easier things become. And something that can help us along the way with that is thinking about the media. So we know that it's something that can greatly increase our anxiety. Newspapers or any online social media, which are really focused on the current global situation. And we know that the stress that's caused by the media can lead to some really negative behaviours as well. Linking back to the vicious cycle that we looked at earlier on, perhaps reading lots and going on social media lots as a behaviour can really fuel our anxiety, and could also then lead to lots of further unhelpful behaviours. For example, researching things on the internet. Limiting the amount of time we spend reading the news or reading any kind of media or social media could be beneficial for anxiety levels. We also may want to stick to reading more reputable sources that might give more factual information. It might be helpful to take a moment to reflect on your use of the media and how much social media you take in each day. So maybe pause the video and ask some of these questions to yourself. So does the media increase or decrease my anxiety? And if it does, is there a way that we can reduce this? Or is there something else that we could replace it with? And maybe if there's something that you can take away from this exercise, maybe thinking of one small thing that you might be able to change that might help with this. So one small change that you could make.
Nice. We've come to the end of the workshop for today, and these are the final tips that we have. And it's really a summary of the main sort of take-home points that we want you to focus on from today. So first of all, do remember this saying, worry is only helpful if it leads us to take action. We also want you to remember that our mind and our body are very interlinked, and often if we relax our body by doing some relaxation behaviours, this can have a positive impact on how anxious we feel and on the kinds of anxious thoughts that we have as well. We also want to encourage you to notice your triggers, and that may be media use, for example, and try to minimise these. And then also be mindful, because we can't always get rid of our triggers, and there are certain things that we're worried about that we can't change and we have no control over. So it's also about being mindful of the things that we can and that we can't change, and being kind and compassionate to ourselves if we don't always get things right straight away. And finally, again, just to be cautious of the media that we're engaging with, and maybe putting a time limit on this is another thing that can be helpful. So thank you very much for listening to us today. As we said before, we are from the Camden ICOPE Psychological Therapy Service. We do have an email address, which is on the screen, and a phone number. We're not able to kind of pick up the phone at the moment because a lot of us are remote working, but we do respond to voicemails that are left with your name and contact details. If you do feel like some of the things that we're talking about kind of resonate with you and you'd be kind of interested in pursuing a referral with us, then there's also information as well on how to make a self-referral. And here's also some further information on further reading that you might want to look at around managing stress and worry. And there's a lot of really good resources and organisations out there. So you might want to pause the video now and take a note of a few of these links. And the links can also be found on our website as well under the coronavirus advice banner. So I just wanted to say thank you again for taking the time to listen to us today. And here are some references in terms of some of the things where we've drawn some of our techniques and strategies from. Thank you very much.